Dear Dr. Bala, who has been insisting on me coming and talking to all of you, but because of my anarchic schedule, it has not been possible to locate a date when he would be here and I would be here, and at the same time I will not be bothered about too many things that are happening which keep me busy. So we located this date, but both of us fell ill, and I recovered a little sooner than him, and still he is under the impact of antibiotic, but I have got out of it, but still my throat is not too good. You know, I am really happy to talk to a set of brilliant people who have been assembled to listen to ideas which you may not find in textbooks, which you may not find in any great notable authority quoting. You will be listening to me mostly on the knowledge that I have gathered by the society, through the society, which I construe as an open air university. I don't think there is any greater teacher than the society itself. But unfortunately, we miss the society in our entire gamut of learning. And that I learned, that I understood only after I left the college. When I left formal learning, then I understood how important it is to study a society which has thousands of years of continuity. And it has so much to say, which you may agree or disagree. But learning does not always mean you agree. Learning also means you disagree. So in that sense, I will be talking to you about my experience in business, about entrepreneurship, about management, about culture, about value systems, how all this has what we call as economic impact. You notice today the science of economics has been reduced to a robotic exercise of considering human beings as a bundle of wants and needs. You know, this has been going on for the last 100 years, 150 years since Karl Marx made its advent in the field of politics, sociology and economics. I have taught this in IIT Bombay over 21 hours. So I have to pack it in a very limited period here. I am not a very skilled teacher, but I am also a teacher by accident. Because many things in my life have been accidents which I have appropriated as my success. I was arrested by Rajiv Gandhi at 12:30 midnight once on grounds that I had fought corruption, but he laid a charge of espionage on me. It was a completely false charge. So I became famous all over the country. I did nothing to become famous, but I became famous. Even becoming a chartered accountant was a kind of an accident because I could not get my school final certificate in time. Because of that, I changed my mind from being an engineer to becoming a chartered accountant. That's how I became a chartered accountant. I became a journalist again by accident. I never thought I would be a journalist because chartered accountants are used to writing long documents. So when I had investigated the Reliance Group and prepared a huge volume of their shenanigans, we called a meeting of all the journalists in Indian Express. At that time, unfortunately, Arun Shourie was not with us. So all other journalists we called and asked them to look at the investigative work I had done, because I have been a very noted chartered accountant with a background of investigation into financial matters. So when I explained all this to them, the journalists felt it is such a boring subject, nobody will read it, and that is your investigation. Why should I write on it? So Mr. Goenka told me there is no alternative, you have to become a journalist. So that is, I had to paradigm shift from drafting documents of 100 pages, 150 pages into writing articles of 1200 words. That's also an accident in life. So I am presenting myself before you as someone who has been shaped by coherent accidents in life. and I will share my experiences with you, which may be very useful to you, because everybody's experience, which is acquired by enormous amount of lust for learning, sincerity, commitment, is useful. So it is in that sense I will be sharing my experience with you. I was talking to the Indian Council of Social Science Research in Delhi, and I was relating to them my experience in IIT Bombay. And I will first take my experience in IIT Bombay, and then I say what I spoke in the ICSSR in Delhi some couple of months back. IIT Bombay Institute of Management had invited me to deliver a lecture on a program which they were conducting for a couple of days called Avenues in the year 2010, that is available on the net if you, some of you are interested to waste about 80 minutes of your time. That lecture is a very interesting lecture, but you have to sustain your interest for 80 minutes. So in that, Adi Godrej spoke ahead of me, and he presented in India to the students there, to the faculty, to the research scholars, to the invited audience, that India was always a poor and a country of, he didn't say beggars, but we were all beggars. And only after 91, 92, when we set out to do this globalization and liberalization, we came to know what is comfort, what is quality of life, what is standard of living. And he said that we had only what is known as the Hindu rate of growth till that time. Only after that we began to grow at 6% and 7% and 8%. I found the entire audience standing up and clapping him. That speech was one of the well constructed speeches, must have been prepared by a lot of people with knowledge of modern economics as we understand it today. But I was to speak next, and I had gone to talk to the IIT students about how they should build India. But now I have been presented with the problem that there is something very seriously wrong with India, and unless we handle this problem, there is no way that India is going to lead the world. Now I am taking you to a research which has been done by the National Intelligence Council of America, which is the think tank attached to the Central Intelligence Agency, that by 2030, India would be one of the 3 most powerful global powers, along with America and China. All other so-called powers today will have only regional character. These 3 powers will have only global character. Of course, at that time, BRICS study and other studies had come, but not this kind of study which focused on these 3 nations and explained their geopolitical, military, scientific, technological, educational and cultural capabilities to provide leadership to the world. But BRICS studies and other studies had come. So I told them that India is going to emerge as a very major force. But what do we know about India? We seem to know nothing about India. And I have great respect for Mr. Godrej, but unfortunately I have to differ very seriously from his presentation of what India was and what India is capable of, what its potentialities are. And unless you identify your true self, you can never be able to contribute, because you can never be the carbon copy of someone and contribute to the world. So I said the idea that India is something which needs to be fundamentally corrected. Where it originated, in whom it originated, how it dominated the world, and how it dominates ourselves, our academics, our intellectuals, our educational institutions, our teaching models, Unless we zero in on that, then we will never be able to understand what we can do in a world which expects India to become a global power. So I said it all started with Karl Marx, who wrote a couple of articles in the New York Herald Tribune, in which he said that it is a very peculiar country. It has some kind of a common governance model, though it is divided into several rulers and all that. There is some kind of infrastructure maintenance, waterways maintenance, mobility of people from one end of the country to the other. It is all very orderly. But its economics is organized on the basis of village republic. Each village is an economic unit by itself. It does not need, so self-contained, it does not need anything from other village. This is a very peculiar model of development, because there is no huge distance between the producer and the consumer. Everybody is producing or doing something for the other. There was no high level of exploitation. But there is a problem with this society. This society is worshipping monkeys and cows, and it is semi-barbaric. And it has not changed for the last 2000 years. And they are claiming an antiquity which predates our antiquity. And so there is something very seriously wrong with this society. And unless this society is shaken up and its economy and society are destroyed, it will never be prepared for revolution which is necessary for progress. Because there is a communist theory, unless there is an evolution which overthrows the past, you can never achieve progress. He said for that purpose, if India is to be prepared, the only way what the British is doing is the right way, namely to destroy the society and the economy of India. It is a very painful destruction, but it is pleasurable also, because this destruction is necessary for the growth of India. All of us read Karl Marx. In fact, he has been one of the most influential thinkers in India and outside for the last 100 years. But he never came to India. He never read any Indian literature. He never met any Indian worth the name. But he pronounced on India, and India accepted his thoughts about itself. It's a fundamental thing. All of you are bright students. If somebody doesn't come to Great Lakes Institute at all, but he pronounces this, what is there, they are, it's like any other institute. I mean, there is nothing wrong in somebody expressing that view, but are you going to accept that view is the issue. But unfortunately, the Indian system, Indian intellectual system, was not robust enough to counteract this. We accepted this. His assessment, illiterate assessment about India, as something which, and then came Max Weber. If anybody could be called as the philosophic godfather of the modern Western civilization, it is Max Weber. Those who have read sociology and economics together, he was the person who understood sociology and economics are so interlaced that you cannot separate one from the other. So he theorized that, of course, he had all the reasons for that. He studied the Western society and he came to the conclusion that the Protestant societies move faster because there is individualism, there is enterprise, there is entrepreneurship, and so the Protestant societies are more compatible with the competitive nature of modern capitalism, and so they grow faster. All the Catholic societies are lagging behind because they are not promoting individualism, enterprise, entrepreneurship, because they are under the control of the church. He was right, because whether it is America, whether it is Canada or England or Australia or New Zealand, they were all moving faster. But all the Catholic nations have been falling behind, whether it is Italy, whether it is Spain, whether it is even Germany, whether it is France. Most of these nations were falling behind. He was right. On an empirical study, because he had made the study over a period of couple of decades, This was sometimes close to 1897 or so, where he also theorized what is known as the modern Western anthropology based on individualism. It is individualism which will drive politics, economics, sociology. There will be no society. It will be only collection of individuals held together by a constitution and a state. This was his view, and towards which the entire West moved, and the rest of the world also tends to move. He was right. But he wrote a book, The Religion of Hinduism and Buddhism, some 20 years later, where he said that there are two societies which can never come up under modern capitalism, that is India and China, because they follow Hinduism and Buddhism, which believe in karma and rebirth, which has no scope for the individual development, individual enterprise, entrepreneurship. So unless these two societies are restructured fundamentally, it is not possible for these two societies to grow. You can Google and get the researchers if there are any two great thinkers. And he also didn't come to India. He never met any great Indian. Of course, he had read some Indian literature, which Karl Marx did not. You can go and Google and get any amount of researchers which will show if there are two great thinkers who dominated the Indian sociology, Indian politics, Indian economics, Indian administration. It is Karl Marx and Max Weber. This trend of thinking continued in India, and in 1978, Dr. Raj Krishna, who was an economist of repute and who was a socialist economic thinker, he was also advisor to the government of India at one point in time. He was asked in a question and answer session that we also follow the same socialist policies which Russia does, which China does, which East European countries do. But they are moving faster than us. Why? He gave a cultural reason for that. He said culturally India is not fit for development. He said we can have only Hindu rate of growth. That is how the word Hindu rate of growth came. That fundamentally something wrong with India. And this was taken to an extreme by Robert McNamara, who was the World Bank president at the time. He addressed at least 3 world conferences where he said, I am begging for India because this is one society which cannot stand on its own legs. This trend of thinking continued till 1983. I want you to mark the date 1983 because many of you would not have come across that, because most institutions do not teach this. IIT did not teach this. It was in 1983, Paul Bairoch, a Belgian economist, who had been given the responsibility of writing the economic, trade and economic history of the world between 1750 and 1900. He produced his research which showed that if you look at the economic development levels of different countries in 1750, India and China were leading together with almost 60% of world GDP, and America and England put together had only 2% of world GDP in 1750. India's share was 24.5% and China's share was almost 34%. And everything changes upside down in 1900, when China and India crashed to 8% together, India 1.8% and China 6.2%. And America and England zoomed from 2% to 41%. So Paul Bairoch said this is where the whole transformation took place. This shook the West. Many French scholars began saying, let us accept that in 16th, 17th and even partly 18th centuries, we didn't have as good a standard of living as England, let us accept it. The West could not accept it. So they constituted a study Development Studies Institute under OECD nations, headed by Angus Maddison, the greatest economic historian ever. And he came out with his magnum opus, World Economic History, a Millennial Perspective, in the year 2001, which is regarded as the most authentic economic history of the world today. There is no dispute about it. He said in the first year of the Common Era, India was leading with 34% of world GDP. 10th century India was leading. 11th India was leading. 13th India was leading. 14th India was leading. 15th India and China equal. 16th China overtook India. 17th India overtook China. The game was between these two countries. And there are umpteen researches. In fact, in the Egyptian Roman history, Pliny the Elder, he addresses the Roman Parliament in the 1st century, that we see all over Rome, Egypt, only Indian ships. They are looting our gold. And you go through any amount of researches which will show India's merchant navy was one of the, it was topping even Greece. India's merchant naval history is recorded in the Navy website of India. You can go and look at it. And Marco Polo, who came to India, he said that gold is cheaper than silver in India, because India had accumulated so much of gold. And then in Akbar's period, it has been measured by scientific study that the average consumption in India was better than the consumption of most Western countries. I mentioned all this to the IIT audience. After I completed the speech, they gave me a standing ovation, but they came and also said, "Sir, we know nothing about these things. We want you to teach it for us." That is how I became the visiting professor to the IIT. So you can understand how we believe in people and their opinion, and we forget there are completely contrary evidence. For example, if Paul Bairoch had done this research in 1830, Karl Marx would not have made these 2 articles he could not have written in 1854. If this research has been done in 1920, I don't think Max Weber would have got the guts to say that these 2 civilizations which had been topping the world's development for 1700 years is unfit for development. So I found there is an all-round literacy in India about India. And it is dangerous, because India is an emerging power and people would like to know, how are you a power? What is it that makes you a power? We must know what is our potentiality, what is our competence, what is our limitation, what is our strength, weakness. Your SWOT analysis of a civilization is a continuing process. It doesn't stop at any one point in time. No society is always strong, no society is always weak, provided it has the potentiality to leverage on its strength, inherent strength, overcome its weakness and become strong. We have seen this all over the world, nations doing it. Take a nation like Israel. 2000 years before they were thrown out, they were thrown in 108 countries in the world. They were butchered, raped and maimed. But they had one thought, Israel, it is my country. 2000 years Israel was only in the imagination of the Jews, and they got Israel. And in 1967, you will all be very proud to know that the Israeli consulate in Bombay published a book, Jews in Israel. That book copy is not available anywhere. I have put it on my website. If you want, you can go and log and get it. In which the editor writes that in 107 out of 108 countries, we were butchered and killed, and there was genocide. There was only one country in which we were received and treated. And the Jews who came back from India to Israel had no complaint, they had only praise for the country. At that time, there was no Constitution of India, there was no fundamental right, there was no minority rights. What made the Indian civilization treat them as equals? The same case with the experience with Parsis. We know nothing. So, my conviction whenever I have spoken to highly educated people is that our knowledge is thoroughly externalized. I have gone to PSG Institute of Management. It's not a metro, a reasonably rural setting. But that PSG Institute of Management will be studying about the movement of prices in NASDAQ. It will not be studying about Tirupur. I will tell you about Tirupur. You must have now known about Tirupur because Tirupur is quite in the news. But when I went to Tirupur, Tirupur was not in the news. Boston Consulting sent a team to study, Boston University sent a team to study Tirupur because they found that from Tirupur a very big knitwear industry is emerging, and they found that there was no Tirupur in India map. Then they reduced and they found there is one Tirupur in Tamil Nadu, and that is 50 kilometers from Coimbatore. And they sent a team and they asked the PSG Institute of Management, please help them with logistics, book their hotels and arrange for their car. PSG Institute was so happy that Boston University has asked them to arrange these things. It is they who produced the first book, Fraternal Capital, and that was done by one Chari who belonged to Tamil Nadu, who studied the Tirupur development as an amazingly different model, which I think is worth studying. I told Dr. Bala that in India, entrepreneurship is not an individual choice. It is a product of social ecosystem. Unless you understand the social dynamics of India, the entrepreneurial development you can never understand. I will tell you what is my own experience. When the tsunami of globalization hit India, I am a corporate advisor. Of course, now I have reduced my work less because I feel that is no more greatly interesting though paying. Many top business groups in India had always sought my advice. But I found there was such a fear, terrified corporate atmosphere. They didn't know whether to run their industry or to sell their industry. Many people in the government were advising them that India was always known to be a great trader. We were never known to be a great producer. It is better for you to sell your units and become a trader. This was how many officials of the government of India were advising our own industrialists. The one man who stood against it, I always mention his name, he was Ratan Tata. When everybody said you have to close down your automobile unit, you have to close down your steel unit, because you cannot scale it up for 20 million tons and 30 million tons, you cannot produce 1 million cars and 1 million trucks. So you have to close down all this because you cannot scale up to global level of operations, you cannot accumulate that kind of capital, you don't have human resources of that kind. He said, I will produce an Indian car. I didn't find many industrialists like that. Then I decided I should take a travel across the country. You know why? When Mahatma Gandhi came back to India, he went and met Gopal Krishna Gokhale. Gopal Krishna Gokhale told him that you have been out of India for so long. India has changed a lot. You must understand what is India before you begin to work for India, what it needs, what it does not need, what is its strength, what is its weakness. So you take a travel across the country. He booked his railway tickets, everything, arranged all his logistics, but put one condition. 1 year you should travel But you should not speak to anyone about your opinion about what you are observing. After all this, you will come to your conclusion. After 1 year, the Gandhi did, he changed his clothes and became what we see him as Gandhi. A Gandhi dressed with coat and suit could never have conquered India. He communicated with the people of India. He understood what the people of India are. I don't think any corporate communicator could have understood the powerful communication which his dress made. He took over the whole country. And you know what happened afterwards? He unified the disparate political elements. And you know what happened? When we were discussing as a team, we said we know India only through Economic Times, Business Standard, Business Line. I said we should go beyond this to understand what India is. That is how my learning started. That is what I want to share with you, and that is what you should also be doing. I started traveling across the country, from Ludhiana to Batala to Rajkot to Jamnagar. When I went to Ludhiana, I was stunned. Not many people could speak in English, but they were running the best machine shops. World's leading cycle manufacturers were located there. All the multinational cycle companies were sourcing their components in Ludhiana. I was shocked. I spent 3 days in Ludhiana. Every day I used to work with them till 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the morning. And you know what is the reason for the development of that place? It was not university. It was not any management institute. It was not any engineering college. If anyone is from Punjab, they will know the community's name I am mentioning. It is a community called Ramgarhia community. One extraordinary mechanical skill. In fact, many German factories have banned the entry of Ramgarhias in their factory because if they saw a machine, they would replicate it. If they see Bala, they will produce a Bala. It's that kind of competence. It is because of them we have become the most leading cycle manufacturers in the world. I don't think any institute in India studied this. I went to Batala, I went to Rajkot. Everything was a revealing experience, which no books, no university, no amount of training have taught. Rajkot is a desert. You go and see Rajkot. You move out of Rajkot, it is a desert. There is prosperity. How did this prosperity come? The Rajkot Industrial Bodies Association president was talking to me. He didn't know one word of English. I didn't know one word of Gujarati. The only common words we knew was Gujarati and Gujarat. There was no other common word we could understand. There was a translator who told me, and he revealed his experiences, that I asked him, how did you acquire this kind of competence in engine manufacturing, oil engineering manufacturing? He said in the year 1954, one blacksmith, Patel, he imported a machine, and curiosity, he unbundled the machine and found there is nothing great in it, he could produce it himself. That is how he began by reverse engineering producing the machine. And then several people joined in the community. And when I went in 1994, they had about 2,500 ancillary units, 55 assembling units. They were exporting to Saudi Arabia alone machines worth 85 crores at that time. Then I went to Morbi. Have you heard of Morbi? Just lift your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is a very big number because in IIT not many people, at least 1 or 2 people only raised their hands. In many places people did not raise their hands at all. They were very honest. Which is the place with the highest per capita income in India? I will tell you which are not the places. It is not Delhi, it's not Bombay, it's not Calcutta, it's not Bangalore, it's not Chennai, it's not Hyderabad. It is Morbi in Gujarat. Morbi is not one of those places which have always been in a infrastructure is there, educational institutions are there, nothing. In Morbi there are 1000 diamond cutting units, 1000 textile units and 1000 ceramic units. The total population is 2.4 lakhs, you can Google and see it today. Half the population is employed. You have this Ajanta wall clock. It is manufactured in Morbi. They have set up joint venture in China to access the American market because of the MFR treatment. They know nothing, they don't know a word of English. 1/3 of the population is Muslim. They work together. They have built a very prosperous place. I don't think any institute has studied how did this entrepreneurial model came, which is not just a local model, it's a national model, it's a global model. I went to Surat. 25 years back, the biggest problem in Surat was the surrounding villages will converge. 5 lakh people, 6 lakh people will come into Surat with their cattle, everything, because there was no water. Surat was an open air toilet and it became a law and order problem. Government after government did not know how to handle this because you cannot prevent 5 lakh people from coming into Surat. Everyone thought the people who come there are a waste, they are villagers, they are dirtying the city. Those who came here, they learned to diamond cutting. Today no one comes to Surat. The entire South Gujarat has become the diamond cutting factory of the world. Every village cuts diamonds. Thanks to Narendra Modi's initiative, water is available everywhere because of this water distribution system he had evolved in the last 10 years. 9 out of 10 diamonds cut in the world are cut in South Gujarat. We have taken over the diamond cutting trade. Because of that, by backward integration, Kathiawaris have taken over the diamond trade in the world. Out of $24 billion diamond trade in the world, $16 billion is in the hands of Indians. Our Kathiawaris are the most respected diamond traders in Amsterdam. And the news item was about a diamond heist which took place, theft which took place. $250 million diamond was stolen from a highly guarded place with electronic protection, with this, that, but still the thieves always have the capacity to beat anything including technology. So they took away the diamonds. Times of India wrote, diamond is taken on the back of cycles, motorcycles for 50 miles, 100 miles by community couriers all over South Gujarat. Not a single grain of diamond is lost because of the community control. This is what is called social capital. Is there any subject of social capital you are taught? Please teach them social capital. Social capital is a new concept in management, in entrepreneurship, in economic development. It was Emil Durkheim who opposed both Karl Marx and Adam Smith, who said the society is a very important element for development. But Europe cast aside his book. But in 1994, you must have heard about Francis Fukuyama. Heard Francis Fukuyama? Francis Fukuyama is the person who wrote the Bible of globalization. He wrote the book, The End of History and the Lost Man. He said all the conflicts are over, the West has won finally against the rest, it is the best for the rest to follow the West. This was his theory. And it was said that this man has laid the foundation for the future of the world. He became overnight very famous. He was accepted as the person who has identified the only way. He said, market capitalism and liberal democracy have won, and there is no place for conflict hereafter, and there will be only peace and harmony and development in the world. This was his theory in 1992. He wrote this book. But in 1994, something struck him. He wrote a book called The Trust, in which he said, maybe I am wrong. Of course, he didn't say so. Maybe I am wrong. He distinguished between family-based societies and individualist societies and said completely two different laws operate there. And he said the concept of social capital is the capacity of the society to work together. And he said you can form a bank, you can form an army, you can form a police force by state action. But you cannot form families by state, you cannot form communities by state. They are a natural evolution. It is the community model which he called as the social capital, and now it is an accepted fact all over the world that social capital is a functioning reality. Financial capital belongs to you, intellectual capital belongs to you, social capital belongs to the society of which you are only a beneficiary, you are a contributor. And this I have seen working in Ludhiana, in Batala, in Rajkot, in Jamnagar, and Morbi, and Tirupur. And I am going to read out some of these things because a colleague who travelled with me asked him to write this book. This is the book I have prescribed for the IIT Bombay, Indian Model of Economy, Business and Management by Professor Kanak Sapabati. He travelled with me, and I am going to read out some of the experiences, how stunningly things on the ground are different, about which we have absolutely no understanding. You have heard of Sangagiri? Sangagiri is a place which is very near Tiruchengodu in western Tamil Nadu. The background of transport owners in Sangagiri is striking. Of these, you know, Sangagiri is the place where you have seen the huge Taurus vehicles moving all over, carrying this windmill wings, huge Taurus vehicle. 70% of the Taurus vehicle population is owned by the Sangagiri people. 90%, the Sangagiri striking, 90% of them come from agriculture dependent families. Of these, 20% of them were engaged earlier in cattle breeding. One man does something and everybody thinks he can do it because he is my friend, he is my relative. So it is the competitive system within the community which produces an entrepreneurial movement. We have studied none of these things. And I have told you about Morbi, I have told you. In the case of Jamnagar brasswork cluster, people could not continue with agriculture as water became salty due to their proximity to the sea. As a result, they promoted brass units by importing 20% of the raw material from outside the country. India Brand Equity Foundation noted that hinterland India is the real source of entrepreneurship. I don't find entrepreneurs in business schools, IIT. I will relate two experiences of mine. I have asked in many of the business schools, how many of you are going to set up business? Out of 500 or 600 students, only 3 or 4 will lift their hand. I went to a Rotaract meeting in Kodaikanal, about which I told Dr. Bala, in which there were 150 students. Girls were almost half. So whenever I address the students for longer duration, I address them for half a day. So I asked each one of them to stand up and say, what are you going to do in life? What is your goal in life? And almost half of them, 60, 70 students said they were going to set up business. I was shocked. In hinterland, in Kodaikanal, which is the assembly of about 3-4 districts surrounding that place, so many people want to set up business. I asked them to stand up. Say, where are they coming from? They are coming from Tirupur, they are coming from Karur, they are coming from Namakkal, they are coming from Sivakasi. It is not the educational institutions which inspired them to think of becoming entrepreneurs, it is the society. I went to Bharatidasan Institute of Management in the year 2000, about which I wrote an article also. The director said, sir, you have come on a golden day of our institute. What is the golden day? Sir, today McKinseys are going to come. And I am going to say, yesterday all have been placed, you have nobody to take from our institute. So I said, how many students are there for the final year examination? That was December, the examination is going to be next March. Already these students are placed. Why should they write the examination? I don't know. So I asked the director of that institute, from how many applicants you choose these 60 people for admission? Sir, we received 10,000 applications and you choose 60 people. Why do you want to hold them for 2 years? They are the best among the 10,000 and you can offer them to any corporate straight away. You need not have to waste their time by detaining them in your institute. So then I addressed the students. I said, you are the best 120 out of 20,000 applicants. If all of you are going for jobs, who is going to give job for the remaining 19,880 students? They had no answer. India is a country of entrepreneurship. Have you heard of Global Entrepreneur Monitor Study? GEM 2002, where India joined for the first time. Global Entrepreneur Monitor Study. For the first time, India joined the Entrepreneur Monitor Study. I suppose. So, where was I? Global Entrepreneur Monitor Study. So they found entrepreneurship in India is so intense that between India, China and America, India tops with 17% of the people wanting to become entrepreneurs out of 100. And it is 11 in China and 10 in America. You will be surprised. Whereas the educational institutions do not betray this, where is this entrepreneurship coming from? There is one economic census of India. The economic census of India is every 10 years it is done. The last thing was in 2015. It's all on the net, you can go and see. And the economic census said there are 58 million non-farming business units comprising of manufacturing, trading, services. 58 million, which provide self-employment and employment for 128 million people. Your entire corporate sector, public and private put together, provides employment for 12.8 million people. And this number has not very much increased between 1992 and 2014. When I discussed this with Mr. Narayan Murthy, Narayan Murthy said, we have ourselves added 3.7 million jobs. Mr. Narayan Murthy, when software companies add one job, you must understand there are 4 jobs going already. You are replacing humans. You must, good or bad, you must understand that. And when you are increasing jobs, others are reducing jobs. So the total increase in jobs between 1992 and 2014 in this 22-year period is an appallingly low 20 lakhs in the organized sector. So I made a presentation to Mr. Narendra Modi. India is not employable. It can only be self-employed. And beautifully, the census of India captured, economic census of India captured, that 72% of these 58 million units are called own account enterprises. The automobile workshop, the tea stall, the barber shop, the washerman, all of you that you see, they are all entrepreneurs. You don't recognize them as entrepreneurs. They don't want your capital, they don't want your anything which the government offers. And many of these industrial clusters, according to UNIDO, have evolved on their own. Only about 20 industrial clusters have been supported by government investment. Rest has been done up by the society itself. So this 128 million self-employment, it breeds self-employment. You have seen, you go to any hotel and you ask the proprietor, sir, what were you doing? He didn't read catering management. He was a server in a hotel 20 years back. You don't learn catering from institutes. You learn catering by doing catering. And if somebody establishes hotels, of course, this catering manager will go and manage. This is the substance of India. You know, the story is not very different. There is a book written by two Harvard scholars, Transforming China. The Deng Xiaoping and Transformation of China. That book came in 2014. It's one of the finest books to be studied. In that book, how Deng developed China, which had a frozen mindset against capital, against rich, against proprietors. Deng picked up one sentence out of Karl Marx's writings. You know, Karl Marx's writing is like a religious text. You cannot change, you cannot vary, you cannot reinterpret. You have to accept it as it is and then develop. He had put all the conditions for not developing, but Deng found a way to develop. I tell you, Karl Marx wrote in one place, if anyone employing more than 7 persons is a capitalist, more than 8 persons is a capitalist. Deng said up to 7 persons nobody is a capitalist. He made it big. So 28 million town and village enterprises were developed, and that provided 128 million employment. Two Nobel laureates studied this phenomenon and said, it is these town and village enterprises which lifted millions, 150 million people above the poverty line in China. This potentiality of entrepreneurship. So we did an experiment. We took people from Namakkal, Kozhikode, Tiruchengodu, and made the management institute people to listen to them. How did they set up the business? It's a revealing experience. So we have a very critical job to do in the next few years, with India emerging as a top nation in the world. If we do not know the potentiality of India, where its strength comes from, then you are not going to be a contributor to India, you are only going to be a consumer in India. I will complete with where the world is going and where the world led us to. This entire economic development model originated that there is only one development model, and that is the Western model. Everybody will have to follow that model, otherwise nobody can be a success. Was the product of Max Weber's thinking. And it went a step further. You must have heard about Walter Rostow's 4 stages of economic growth. Is it taught to you? If it is not taught, I will congratulate you, because this is what is taught in most business schools. as the stages of economic development. A classic of the genre was Walter Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth, with its unilinear sequence of 5 development stages from traditional societies to the age of mass consumption. Explicitly argued as an alternative to Marx's stages of progress, Rostow's theory appeared as a mirror image, with the added advantage of turning the left twice over. Common to many theories of development was a cheerful sense of cultural tragedy. What Walter Rostow says, I tell you, and I will link it to how it was hawked all over the world by no less than United Nations. In Rostow's disintegration of the traditional societies that function, in Rostow's scheme, is a precondition for economic takeoff. Foreign domination was needed to accomplish this salutary destruction, since otherwise the customary relationship of traditional production would set a ceiling on economic growth. Exactly what Karl Marx said. By its own providential history, Europe had been able to develop itself, but according to Rostow, other peoples would have to be shocked out of their backwardness by an intrusive alien force. This is taught in most business schools. No revolutionary himself, Rostow could agree with Karl Marx that in order to make omelette, one must crack the eggs first. You will be surprised that this was not a scholastic thinking. And the United Nations in the year 1951 gave a mandate to all the developing nations as to how they can develop, and I am going to read out to you. There is a sense in which rapid progress is impossible without painful adjustments. Ancient philosophies have to be scrapped. Old social institutions have to disintegrate. Bonds of caste, creed and race have to burst. Large number of those who cannot keep up with progress have to have their expectations of a comfortable life frustrated. Very few communities are willing to pay the price for economic progress. You know who said this? UN Department of Social and Economic Affairs Measures for the Economic Development of Underdeveloped Countries in 1951. Every country, including India, began implementing this very seriously in their education system, in their public communication, in their policy making. There is only one way, there is no other way. This was how the world was told. Now see what happens. In 1992, when globalization came, there is only one way, everybody. The world has become one. It's a village, global village. All these we were told, of course, Islamic fundamentalism came and all these talks have stopped. Nobody even talks about globalization today. It had one of the shortest life. Now I will tell you, in 2005, something very different happens. The West understood that this fit-all model is not working even in the West. The way it is working in America, it's not working. In Germany, it's not working. In France, it's not working. In Italy. And so, the central bank governors and finance ministers on 15th of October 2005 made this fantastic statement, which is not debated in India, which is not even known in India. We recognize there is no uniform development approach that fits all countries. These are the G20 nations who were saying till day before yesterday, please follow us. They say there is no uniform development approach that fits all countries. Each country should be able to choose the development approaches and policies that suits the specific characteristics. They completely washed their hands off. This was 2005 October. See what happens in 2005. 2008 May, World Bank, which has been saying please follow this policy 1, 2, 3, 4, it's all what is known as the American model, which was hawked to the world. Now the World Bank says, in our work across the World Bank has learnt the hard way that there is no one model that fits all. Development is all about transformation, and so each nation will have to work out its own policies. I have gone throughout India to talk about this, not a single economist, not a single column writer, not a single think tank do even know that this is the emerging global thinking. And then in 2013, the United Nations, which said there is only one model, it said in June 2013 in the General Assembly debates, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon stressed that there is no one size fit all development model. No one knows about it. And it goes on to say how development is culture related, how development is sociology related, how development is mostly local. You can benefit from ideas from all over. The government of India did not notice. Finally, at least this government took notice of it. You must have heard about the Niti Aayog. Heard of it? The founding document of the Niti Aayog is a cabinet resolution in which they said this. Perhaps most importantly, the Niti Aayog must adhere to the tenet that while incorporating positive influences from the world, no single model can be transplanted from outside into Indian scenario. We need to find our own strategy for growth. The new institution has to zero in on what will work in and for India. Even this is not known. Why I am mentioning this is that we are emerging as a superpower in the world. Believe it first. The world is seeing you as a power, but we don't see ourselves as a power because we don't know who we are. So wherever I go, I used to quote Maharishi Aurobindo, his particular experience in his life, and I quote and complete my speech. Aurobindo went to Pondicherry. At that time, the entire revolutionary movement in India had been crushed and there was complete darkness. The entire idea of freedom had been buried 100 fathoms deep. Aurobindo was a very man educated abroad. His parents sent him at the age of 5, 6, so that he is not brought up in a country of slaves. So he studied in England with complete understanding of a free society, a dominant society, a domineering society. Came back to India and he turned a revolutionary himself, and finally he came back to Pondicherry to think that he has to think beyond politics and revolution. And so everybody was looking at Aurobindo that he will show us the way because he was a very well read man. But Aurobindo was looking at a mystic saint called Kullachami. Those who know Tamil and those who know Bharatiyar here will know Bharatiyar has written poem on Kullachami. So the Kullachami is a madman. He will laugh, he will cry, he will throw stones. So everybody will be looking at with respect. No other country can believe that this thing can happen. And educated people will go and touch his feet. So Aurobindo said, this man is going to show the way. Everybody said, see, he is a madman. We are looking at Aurobindo to show the way. Now he says, this madman will show the way. One day Aurobindo was sitting at the backyard of his house and having a cup of tea along with his colleagues in the morning. Kullachami came and lifted the teacup in front of Aurobindo. Teacup was full. He emptied the teacup and showed the teacup to Aurobindo. Aurobindo said, I have got my lesson. You have lost your tea. What have you got? Tell us. He said, you empty your thoughts and begin thinking afresh, and that is the message he has given to me. and that completely transformed Aurobindo into a Maharishi. We need to empty our thoughts about this country, begin learning about it. You have to take a travel across the country. You can never understand India from classroom or PowerPoint presentation or books. You have to experience India. So I would request Dr. Bala to arrange a tour of select teams to different industrial clusters which have come up on their own with no government help. How did this entrepreneurial spirit generate? That has to be academized. That has to be institutionalized. That has to be formalized. That has to be put in the public domain. Then we will be doing something for India which will work in and for India. Thank you very much.